Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We're starting a new book this week, and it's one that several of you have requested. In fact, I've had a lot of requests for more Graham Masterton. So we're going to start out with the Charnel House this week, and then I have another one planned too. Someone also asked for the Devils of D-Day, so we'll plan that one for the future. But right now, this week, we're going to start with Charnel House. And I do have to mention that when we read some of Masterton's stories, I do have to edit out some of the more intimate scenes. So for those of you that have actually read his books, don't be surprised. That's why you're not hearing some of those sections when I read the story. Anyway, let's start by grabbing a cup of coffee, sitting back and relaxing, and enjoy the story. The Charnel House by Graham Masterton. Chapter 1. The old man came into my office and closed the door. He was wearing a creased linen jacket and a green bow tie, and in his liver-spotted hands he held a Panama hat that had turned brown as a London steak from years of California sun. One side of his face was still prickly with white stubble, so I guessed he couldn't shave too well. He said, almost apologetically, "It's my house. It's breathing." I smiled and said, "Sit down." He sat on the edge of the chrome and plastic chair and licked his lips. He had one of those soft, concerned old faces that make you wish you had a grandfather as nice as that. He was the kind of old guy it would have been satisfying to play chess with, idling away some fall afternoon on a balcony overlooking the beach. He said, "You don't have to believe me if you don't want to, young feller, but I called before, and I said the same thing." I turned over the appointments list on my desk. "Sure, you telephoned last week, right? And the week before. And you told the girl your house was—" I paused and looked at him, and he looked back at me. He didn't finish my sentence for me, and I guess that was because he wanted to hear me say it, too. I gave him a tight, bureaucratic smile. He said, in his gentle, crumbly voice, "I moved into the house from my sister's old apartment up on the hill. I sold some stock and bought it for cash. It was going pretty cheap, and I've always wanted to live around Mission Street. But now, well—" He dropped his eyes and fiddled with the brim of his hat. I picked up my ball pen. I asked him quietly, "Could you tell me your name, please?" "Seymour Wallace. I'm a retired engineer, bridges mainly." "And your address?" 1551 Pilarcitos. "Okay, and your problem is noise?" He looked up again. His eyes were the color of faded cornflowers pressed between the leaves of a book. "Not noise," he said softly. "Breathing." I sat back in my black simulated leather revolving armchair and tapped my ball pen against my teeth. I was pretty used to cranky complaints in the sanitation department. We had a woman who came in regularly, saying that dozens of alligators that kids had flushed down the toilets in the 60s had made their way to the sewers beneath her apartment on Howard and 4th, and were trying to make their way back up the S-bend to eat her. Then there was the young pothead who believed that his water heater was giving off dangerous rays. But, cranks or not, I was paid to be nice to them and listen patiently to whatever they had to say and try to reassure them that San Francisco was not harboring alligator swarms or hidden lumps of green kryptonite. So I said, "Isn't it possible you made a mistake? Maybe it's your own breathing you can hear." The old man shrugged a little, as if to say that was possible, yes, but not really likely. Maybe you have a downdraft in your chimney, I suggested. Sometimes the air comes down an old stack and finds its way through cracks in the bricks where the fireplaces are blocked up. He shook his head. Well, I asked him, if it's not your own breathing, and it's not a draft in your chimney, could you tell me what you think it might be? He coughed and took out a clean but frayed handkerchief to dab his mouth. I think it's breathing, he said. I think there's some kind of animal trapped in the walls. Do you hear scratching, feet pattering, that kind of thing? He shook his head again. Just breathing? He nodded. I waited to hear if he had anything else to say, but he obviously didn't. I stood up and walked across to my window, which overlooked the apartment block next door. On warm days, you'd occasionally see off-duty air hostesses sunning themselves on the roof garden in bikinis that made me consider that flying United had to be the best way. But all that was on show today was an aged Mexican gardener repotting geraniums. I said, if you did have an animal trapped between your walls, it could only survive for so long without food and water, and if it wasn't trapped, you'd hear it running around. Seymour Wallace, engineer, stared at his hat. I was beginning to realize that he wasn't a crank. In fact, he was rather a plain, practical man, and that coming down here to the sanitation department with stories of disembodied breathing must have taken quite a lot of careful consideration. He didn't want to look a fool, but then who does? He said quietly but firmly, It sounds like an animal breathing. I know it's hard to credit, but I've heard it for 3 months now, almost the whole time I've lived there, and it's quite unmistakable. I turned back from the window. Are there any odors? Any unpleasant deposits? I mean, you're not finding animal excrement in your larder or anything like that. It breathes, that's all, like a German shepherd on a hot day. Pant, pant, pant all night long, and sometimes in the daytime as well. I returned to my desk and sat myself back in my chair. Seymour Wallace looked at me expectantly, as if I could pull some kind of magical solution out of my bottom left drawer, but the truth was that I was authorized to exterminate rats, cockroaches, termites, wasps, lice, fleas, and bedbugs, but so far my authority didn't extend to breathing. Mr. Wallace, I said as kindly as I could, are you sure you've come to the right department? He coughed. Do you have any other suggestions? As a matter of fact, I was beginning to wonder if a psychiatrist might be a good idea, but it's kind of hard to tell a nice old gentleman straight out that he might be going cuckoo. In any case, supposing there was breathing. I looked across at the contemporary red and green print on the opposite side of the room. There was a time, before our offices were refurbished, when all I had on the wall was a tatty poster warning against handling food with unwashed hands, but these days the sanitation department was far more tasteful. There had even been talk about calling us environmental maintenance executives. I said carefully, if there's no dirt and there are no visible signs of what's causing the breathing, then I don't quite see why you're worried. It's probably just some unusual phenomena that is caused by the way your house is built. Seymour Wallace listened to this with a look on his face that meant, you're a bureaucrat. You have to say all these reassuring things, but I don't believe a word of it. When I'd finished, he sat back on the plastic chair and nodded for a while in reflective silence. If there's anything else you need, I said, if you want your cockroaches wiped out or your rats rounded up, well, you're very welcome. He gave me a hard, unimpressed glance. I'll tell you the truth, he said hoarsely. The truth is that I'm frightened. There's something about that breathing that scares the pants off me. I've only come here because I don't know where else to turn. My doctor says my hearing is fine. My plumber says my drain pipes are A-OK. My builder says my house is sound. And my psychiatrist says there are no imminent signs of senility. All that reassurance, and I can still hear it, and I'm still frightened. Mr. Wallace, I told him, there's nothing I can do. Breathing just isn't my bag. You could come and listen. To breathing? Well, you don't have to. I spread my hands sympathetically. It's not that I don't want to. It's just that I have more pressing matters of city sanitation to deal with. We have a blocked-up sewer on Folsom, and the folks around there are naturally more interested in their own breathing than anyone else's. I'm sorry, Mr. Wallace. There's nothing I can do to help you. He rubbed his forehead wearily, and then he stood up. All right, he said in a defeated voice. I can understand your priorities. I walked round my desk and opened the door for him. He put on his old Panama hat and stood there for a moment as if he was trying to find the words to say something else. If you hear anything else, like pattering feet, or if you find excrement, I told him. He nodded. I know, I'll call you. The trouble with the way things are these days, everybody specializes. You can clean out sewers, but you can't listen to something as strange as a house that breathes. I'm sorry. He reached out and gripped my wrist. His bony old hand was surprisingly strong, and it felt as if I'd been suddenly seized by a bald eagle. Why not stop being sorry and do something positive? He said. He came so close I could see the red tracery of veins in his cloudy eyes. Why not come around when you're finished up here and just listen for 5 minutes? I have some good Scotch whiskey my nephew brought back from Europe. We could have a drink, and then you could hear it. Mr. Wallace. He let go of my wrist and sighed and adjusted his hat. You'll have to forgive me, he said flatly. I guess it's been kind of a strain on the nerves. That's okay, I said. Then, listen, if I find a few spare minutes after work, I'll call by. I can't promise, and if I don't make it, don't worry. I have a late meeting this evening, so it won't be early, but I'll try. Very well, he said, without looking at me. He didn't like losing control of his feelings, and right now he was doing his best to gather them up like a tumbled skein of loose wool. Then he said, It could be the park, you know. It could be something to do with the park. The park? I asked blankly. He frowned, as if I'd said something totally irrelevant, and then he said, Thanks for your time, young man, and walked off down the long, polished corridor. I stood at my open door watching him go. All of a sudden, in the air-conditioned chill, I began to shiver. As usual, the evening's meeting was dominated by Ben Poltick, the executive in charge of garbage disposal. Poltick was a short, wide-shouldered man who looked like a small wardrobe in a plaid jacket. He had been in garbage ever since the general strike of 1934, and he considered its collection and eventual disposal to be one of the highest callings of mankind, which in some ways it was, but not in the sense of highest that he meant it. Today we sat around the conference table and smoked too much and drank stale coffee out of plastic cups, while outside the windows the sky was curtained with purple and faded gold, and the towers and pyramids of San Francisco settled into the glittering, grainy Pacific night. Poltick was complaining that the owners of ethnic restaurants were failing to wrap kitchen refuse in black plastic garbage bags, and that his cleanup crews were having their coveralls soiled by exotic foods. Some of my men are Jewish, he said, relighting his burned-down stogie. The last thing they want is to be soiled all over with food that ain't kosher prepared. Morton Meredith, the head of the department, sat in his chair at the top of the table with a wan, twitchy smile on his face and stifled a yawn behind his hand. The only reason we convened these meetings was because City Hall insisted on inner staff stimulation, but the idea of being stimulated by Ben Poltick was like the idea of ordering lobster at McDonald's. It just wasn't on the menu. Eventually, at 9 o'clock, after a tedious report from the extermination people on the use and misuse of warfarin, we left the building and walked out into the warm night air. Dan Machen, a young beanpole of a guy from the Health Research Laboratory, came pushing across the plaza towards me and clapped me on the back. "You fancy a drink?" he asked me. "Those meetings are enough to turn your throat into a desert preservation zone." "Sure," I told him. "All I have to kill is time." "Time and fleas," Dan reminded me. I don't particularly know why I liked Dan Machen. He was 3 or 4 years younger than me, and yet he had his hair crew-cut like a Kansas wheat field, and he wore big, unfashionable spectacles, which always looked as if they were about to drop off the end of his snubbed-up nose. He wore loose-fitting jackets with patched leather elbows, and his shoes were always scuffed, yet he had a funny, oblique sense of humor which tickled me, and even though his face was pallid from spending too many hours indoors, he played a good game of squash, and he knew as many odd facts and figures as the editors of Ripley. Maybe Dan Machen reminded me of my safe suburban upbringing in Westchester, where all the houses had coach lamps, and all the housewives had blonde, lacquered hair, and drove their children around in Buick station wagons, and every fall the smell of burning leaves would signal the season of roller skating and trick-or-treat. A lot of hard things had happened to me since then, not the least of which was a messy divorce and a fierce but absurd affair, and it was nice to know that such an America still existed. We crossed the street and walked up the narrow sidewalk of Gold Street to Dan's favorite bar, the Assay Office. It was a high-ceilinged room with an odd-style balcony and the wood and brass furniture of a long-gone San Francisco. We found a table next to the wall, and Dan ordered us a couple of Coors. "I meant to go up to Pilarcitos this evening," I told him, lighting a cigarette. "Fun or business?" I shrugged. "I'm not sure. Not much of either." "Sounds mysterious." "It is. An old guy came into the office today and said he had a house that breathed." "Breathed?" "That's right. In fact, it panted like Lassie. He wanted to know if I could do something about it." The beers arrived, and Dan took a long swallow, leaving himself with a white foamy mustache that quite suited him. "It isn't a downdraft in the chimney," I told him, "nor is it any kind of creature trapped inside the wall cavities. In fact, it's a genuine case of inexplicable respiration." That was meant to be a wisecrack, but Dan seemed to take it seriously. He said, "Did he say anything more? Did he tell you when it happened? What time of day?" I set down my glass. "He said it was all the time. He's only lived in the place for a few months, and it's been happening ever since he moved in. He's real frightened. I guess the old coot thinks it's some kind of ghost." "Well, it could be," said Dan. "Oh, sure, and Ben Poltick's grown tired of garbage." "No, I mean it," insisted Dan. "I've heard of cases like that before, when people have heard voices and stuff like that. Under certain conditions, the sounds that were uttered in an old room can be heard again. Sometimes people have claimed to hear conversations that could only have been spoken a century before." "Where did you find all this out?" Dan tugged at his tiny nose as if he was trying to make it grow longer, and I could swear that he faintly blushed. "Well, as a matter of fact," he said, embarrassed, I've always been pretty interested in spirit manifestations. It kind of runs in the family. What, a hard-boiled scientist like you? Now come on, said Dan. It's not as nutty as it seems, all this spirit world stuff. There have been some pretty astounding cases, and anyway, my aunt used to say that the shade of Buffalo Bill Cody came and sat by her bedside every night to tell her stories of the Old West. Really? Buffalo Bill? Dan pulled a self-deprecating face. That's what she said. Maybe I shouldn't have believed her. I sat back in my chair. There was a friendly hubbub of chatter in the bar, and they were bringing out pieces of fried chicken and spare ribs, which reminded me that I hadn't eaten since breakfast. You think I should go up there? I asked Dan, eyeing a girl in a tight white t-shirt with Oldsmobile Rocket printed across her breasts. Well, let's put it this way. I'd go. In fact, maybe we should go up there together. I'd love to hear a house that breathes. You would? Okay. If you want to split the taxi fare, we'll go. But don't think I can guarantee this guy. He's very old, and he may be just hallucinating. A hallucination is a trick of the eyes. I'm beginning to think that girl in the t-shirt is a trick of the eyes. Dan turned around, and the girl caught his eye, and he blushed a deep shade of red. You always do that, he complained irritably. They must think I'm some kind of sex maniac in here. We finished up our beers, and then we left the bar and caught a taxi up to Pilarcitos Street. It was one of those short, sloping streets where you park your car when you're visiting a Japanese restaurant on the main drag, and which, queasy on too much tempura and sake, you can never find again afterwards. The houses were old and silent, with turrets and gables and shadowy porches, and considering that Mission Street was only a few yards away, they seemed to be strangely brooding and out of touch with time. Dan and I stood outside 1551 in the warm evening breeze, looking up at the Gothic tower and the carved balcony, and the grayish paint that flaked off it like the scales from a dead fish. You don't believe a house like this could breathe? He asked me, sniffing. I don't believe any house can breathe, but it smells like he needs his drains checked. For God's sake, Dan complained, no shop talk after hours. You think I go around cocktail parties looking through my guests' hair for lice? I wouldn't put it past you. There was a rusted wrought iron gate, and then 5 angled steps which led up to the porch. I pushed the gate open, and it groaned like a dying dog. Then we went up the steps and searched around in the gloom of the porch for the front doorbell. All the downstairs windows overlooking the street were shuttered and locked, so there didn't seem much point in whistling or calling out. Down the hill, a police car sped past with its siren warbling, and a girl was laughing as she pranced along the street with 2 young boys. All this was happening within sight and earshot, and yet up here in the entrance of 1551 there was nothing but shadowy silence, and a feeling that lost years were eddying past us, leaking out of the letterbox and from under the elaborate front door like sand seeping out of a bucket. Dan said, "There's a knocker here. Maybe I should give it a couple of raps." I peered into the darkness. As long as you don't quote Nevermore at the same time. Yeah, right, said Dan. Even the knocker's creepy. I stepped forward and I took a look at it. It was a huge old knocker, black with age and weathering. It was fashioned like the head of a strange, snarling creature, something between a wolf and a demon, and I didn't find it at all encouraging. Somebody who could happily hang something like that on their front door couldn't be altogether normal, unless they actually enjoyed having nightmares. Under the knocker there was engraved the single word, return. While Dan was hesitating, I took hold of the knocker and banged it 2 or 3 times. The sound echoed flatly inside the house, and we waited patiently on the porch for Seymour Wallace to answer. Dan said, "What do you think that is, that thing on the knocker?" "Don't ask me. Some kind of a gargoyle, I guess. It looks more like a damned werewolf to me." I reached in my pocket for a cigarette. "You've been watching too many old horror pictures." I was just about to bang the knocker again when I heard footsteps shuffling towards us from inside the house. Bolts were pulled back at the top of the door and at the bottom, and then it shuddered open an inch or two until it was stopped by a security chain. I saw the pale face of Seymour Wallace peering around it cautiously, as if he was expecting muggers or Mormons. "Mr. Wallace," I said, "we came to hear the breathing." "Oh, it's you," he said with obvious relief. "Just hold on a moment there and I'll open the door." He slipped the chain and the door shuddered wider still. Seymour Wallace was wearing a maroon bathrobe and slippers, and his thin, bare, hairy legs were showing. Dan said, "I hope we haven't caught you at a bad moment." No, come in. I was only getting ready to take a bath." "I sure like your knocker," I said. "It's kind of scary, though, isn't it?" Seymour Wallace gave me a flicker of a smile. "I suppose so. It came with the house. I don't know what it's meant to be. My sister thinks it might be the devil, but I'm not so sure. And why it should say 'return,' I shall never know." We found ourselves in a high, musty hallway, carpeted in threadbare brown, and with dozens of yellowing prints and engravings and framed letters all over the walls. Some of the frames were empty, and others were cracked, but most of them contained sepia views of Mount Taylor and Cabezon Peak, or foxed and illegible maps, or lists of statistics written in a crabbed and faded handwriting. Beside us, the newel post of the stairs was carved out of dark mahogany, and on top of it was a bronze bear, standing upright, with a woman's face instead of a snout. The stairs themselves, tall and narrow, rose towards the darkness of the second floor like an escalator into the gloomiest recesses of the night. "You'd better come this way," said Seymour Wallace, leading us down the hall towards a door at the end. There was a shabby stag's head hanging over it, with dusty antlers and only one eye. Dan said, "After you," and I wasn't sure if he was joking about the house or not. It couldn't have been much creepier. We entered a small airless study. There were shelves all around that must have been lined with books at one time, but now they were empty. The brownish figured wallpaper behind them was marked with the shadows of where they had once been. In the corner, under a doleful painting of early San Francisco, was a stained leather-topped desk and a wooden stockbroker's chair with 2 slats missing. Seymour Wallace had kept the shutters closed, and the room was suffocating and stale. It smelled of cats, lavender bags, and cockroach powder. "I hear the noise in here more than in any other room," Seymour Wallace explained. "It comes at night mostly, when I'm sitting here writing letters or finishing my accounts. At first there's nothing, but then I start straining my ears, and I'm sure I can hear it. Soft breathing, just as if somebody's walking into the room and is standing a little way away from me, watching me. I've tried not to turn around, but I'm afraid that I always do, and of course there's nobody there." Dan Matchin walked across the worn-out rug. The floorboards creaked under his feet. He picked up an astral calendar from Seymour Wallace's desk and examined it for a moment or two. Then he said, "Do you believe in the supernatural, Mr. Wallace?" "Well, it depends on what you mean by the supernatural." "Ghosts, specifically." Seymour Wallace glanced at me and then back to Dan Matchin. I think he was afraid that we were putting him on. In his maroon bathrobe, he looked like one of those elderly men who insist on taking a dip in the ocean on Christmas Day. Dan Matchin said, "I was telling my colleague here that some houses act as receivers for sounds and conversations from the past. If anything particularly stressful has happened inside them, they kind of store up the sound in the texture of their walls and play it back like a tape recorder, over and over again. There was a case in Massachusetts only last year when a young couple claimed to have heard a man and a woman arguing in their living room at night, but whenever they went downstairs, there was nobody there. They heard actual names being shouted, though, and when they went to their local church register and checked them up, they found that the people they could hear had lived in their house in 1860. Seymour Wallace rubbed his bristly chin. "You're trying to say that when I hear breathing, it's a ghost?" "Well, not exactly a ghost," said Dan. "It's just an echo from the past. It might be frightening, but it's no more dangerous than the sound you can hear from your television. It's just sound, that's all." Seymour Wallace sat slowly down on the old stockbroker's chair and looked at us gravely. "Can I get it to leave me alone?" he asked. "I mean, can you exorcise it?" "I don't think so," said Dan, "not without knocking the house down. What you're hearing is within the fabric of the house itself." I coughed and said politely, "I'm afraid there's a city ordinance against knocking down these old houses for meretricious reasons, subsection 8. Seymour Wallace looked very tired. "You know something," he said. "I've wanted one of these houses for years. I used to walk by here and admire their age and their character and their style. At last I've managed to get one. It means a great deal to me, this house. It represents everything I've done in my life to maintain the old true standards against the easy, false, beguiling modern world. Look at this place. There isn't a foot of formica, an ounce of plastic, or a scrap of fiberglass. These moldings around the ceiling are real plaster, and these floorboards came from an old sailing ship. Look how wide they are. Now, look at those doors. They're solid, and they hang true. The hinges are brass." He raised his head, and when he spoke there was a great deal of emotion in his voice. "This house is mine," he said, "and if there's a ghost in it, or a noise in it, I want it out. I'm the master of this place, and by God, I'll fight any supernatural oddity for the right to say that." I said, "I don't like to sound as if I don't believe you, Mr. Wallace, because I'm sure you've heard what you say you did. But don't you think you've been overworking, maybe? Maybe you're just tired." Seymour Wallace nodded. "I'm tired, all right, but I'm not so tired that I won't fight to keep what's mine." Dan Matchin looked around the room and said, "Maybe you should come to some arrangement with this breathing, strike some kind of compromise." "I don't understand." "Well, I'm not sure that I do either, but lots of spiritualists seem to believe that you can do deals with the spirit world to have yourself left alone. I mean, the whole reason a place gets itself haunted is because the spirit isn't free to get itself off to whatever or wherever spirits hang out. So maybe this breathing spirit is trying to get you to help it accomplish something. I don't know, it's just a thought. Maybe you ought to try and talk to it." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you suggest I say?" asked Seymour Wallace cautiously. "Be blunt. Ask it what it wants." "Oh, come on, Dan," I butted in. "This is ridiculous." "No, it isn't. If Mr. Wallace here can hear the breathing, then maybe whatever's doing the breathing can hear him. We don't yet know that there is any breathing." Well, but supposing there is. Seymour Wallace stood up. I guess the only way I'm going to convince you is if you hear it for yourself. Why not have a glass of scotch? Then maybe we can sit down here for a half an hour, if you can spare it, and we'll listen. Sure, I'd love to, said Dan. Seymour Wallace shuffled out of the room and came back a few moments later with 2 bentwood chairs. We sat down, upright and uncomfortable, while he shuffled off again to fetch his decanter. I sniffed the musty air. It was really hot and stuffy in that tiny library, and I was beginning to wish I was back in the assay office drinking a cooled Coors. Dan rubbed his hands together in a businesslike kind of way and said, "This is going to be wild." "You mean you think we're going to hear it?" "Sure, I think we're going to hear it. I told you, I believe in this stuff. I nearly saw a ghost once." "What, you nearly saw it? What does that mean?" "I was staying at an old hotel in Denver, and I was going back to my room one night when I saw the chambermaid coming out of it. I put my key in the door, and she said, 'Are you sure you have the right room, sir? There's a gentleman taking a bath in there.' Well, I checked my key number, and it was the right room, so I went inside. The chambermaid followed just to check, and when I looked in the bathroom, there was nobody taking a bath. No water in the bathtub, no nothing. Hotels are great places for ghosts." "Sure, and the sanitation department is a great place for liars." Right then, Old Man Wallace came back with a tarnished silver tray bearing a decanter of whiskey and 3 tumblers. He set them down on the table and poured us each a generous glassful. Then he sat in his chair and sipped the scotch as if he was testing it for hemlock. Outside in the hallway, a clock that I hadn't seen when I walked in struck 10. Dan Machen said, "Do you have any ice, Mr. Wallace?" Seymour Wallace looked at him in confusion and then shook his head. "I'm sorry, the icebox is broken. I've been meaning to have it fixed. I eat out mostly, so I haven't felt the need." Dan lifted his glass. "Well, here's to the breathing, whoever it is." I swallowed warm, neat scotch and grimaced. We waited there in silence for almost 10 minutes. It's surprising how much noise you make drinking whiskey in total quiet. After a while, I could hear that invisible clock ticking out there in the hallway, and even the distant murmur of traffic on Mission. And there was that rushing sound of my own blood circulating in my ears. Seymour Wallace suppressed a cough and then said, "More whiskey?" Dan Machen held his glass out, but I said, "If I have any more, I'll be hearing bells, not breathing." We settled back on our chairs again, with an awkward creaking of wood. Dan Machen said, "Do you know anything about the history of this house, Mr. Wallace? Anything that might help you identify who this mystery breather might be?" Seymour Wallace nervously rearranged the things on his desk, pen, letter opener, calendar, and then looked at Dan with that same defeated look he'd had on his face when we first came into my office. "I looked at the deeds, and they go back to 1885, when the house was built. It was owned by a seed merchant, and then by a naval captain. But there weren't anything unusual, nothing to make you think there might have been stress here, no murders or anything like that." Dan swallowed some more whiskey. "Maybe the breather sticks around because he was happy here. That sometimes happens. A ghost haunts a house trying to recapture its old joy." "The happy breather?" I asked in disbelief. "Sure," retorted Dan defensively. "It's been known." We lapsed into silence again. Both Dan and I sat there reasonably still, but Seymour Wallace seemed to twitch and scratch as if he was really unsettled. The clock struck the half hour, and still we waited, and still we heard nothing. All around us, the dark bulk of the old house remained hushed, with not even the sound of a roof timber creaking or a window rattling. Over 100 years, this building had done all the settling it was going to do, and now it was dead, immobile, and quiet. I laid down my whiskey glass on the edge of Seymour Wallace's desk. He glanced up at me briefly, and I smiled, but he simply turned away, biting his lip. Perhaps he was worried that there wouldn't be any breathing tonight, in which case he was either lying or going out of his mind. Just then, Dan said, "Shh." I froze and listened. I said, "I don't hear anything." Seymour Wallace lifted his hand. "At first it's very soft," he said, "but it grows louder. Listen." I strained my ears. There was still the ticking of the clock outside, still the distant murmur of traffic. But there was something else, too, something so faint that all of us were frowning in concentration as we tried to hear it. It was like a sibilant whispering at first, like the wind tossing a piece of soft tissue across a room. But gradually it grew more distinct, and all I could do was turn to look at Dan to see if he was hearing what I was hearing, to make sure that it wasn't autosuggestion or a trick of the wind. It was breathing. Slow, deep breathing, like the breathing of someone asleep. It went in and out, with measured respiration, as if lungs were being endlessly filled and emptied with hopeless regularity, the breathing of someone who slept and would never reach morning. Now I knew why Seymour Wallace was frightened. This sound, this breathing, could make your skin prickle with cold. It was the breathing of someone who could never wake up. It was more to do with death than it was to do with life, and it went on and on and on, louder and louder, until we no longer had to strain our ears, but simply sat there, staring at each other in horror and fright. Dan said, "Oh my God." It was impossible to say where the breathing came from. It was all around. I even looked at the walls to make sure that they weren't sagging in and out with every breath. Seymour Wallace was right. The house was breathing. The house itself was not dead, as it had first appeared, but asleep. I whispered, Dan, what is it? Challenge it, Dan, like you said. Ask it what it wants." Dan licked his lips. All around us, the breathing went on, slow and heavy. Sometimes I thought it was going to stop, but then another deep breath would come, and another. And if it had been breathing like this for more than 100 years, it was probably going to go on forever. Dan coughed. "I can't," he said hoarsely. "I don't know what to say." Seymour Wallace himself just sat there, tense and still, for the first time this evening, his whiskey untouched in his hand. Slowly, cautiously, I stood up. The breathing didn't falter. It was as loud now as if I was sleeping next to someone in the same bed, and they had turned to face me in the darkness. I said, "Who's there?" There was no response. The breathing went on. "Who's there?" I said louder. "What do you want? Tell us what you want and we'll help you." The breathing continued, although for some reason I thought it sounded harsher. It was quicker, too. Dan said, "Don't, for God's sake." I ignored him. I walked into the center of the room and called out, "Whoever's breathing, listen. We want to help you. Tell us what to do and we'll help you. Give us a sign. Show us that you know we're here." Seymour Wallace said, "Please, I think this is dangerous. Let's just listen and leave it alone." I shook my head. "How can we? Dan here believes in ghosts, and you say it scares you. Well, I can hear it too, and if I can hear it, that means there's something there, because I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not particularly scared." The breathing grew quicker and quicker. It was still the breathing of a sleeper, but of a sleeper who dreams, or a sleeper who is going through nightmares. Seymour Wallace stood up, his face drawn and pale, and whispered, "My God, it's never been as loud as this before. Please don't say any more. Just leave it alone, and it'll go away." "Whoever's breathing," I called crisply, "whoever's there, listen. We can help you. We can help you leave this house." The breathing was almost frantic now, panting, whining. Seymour Wallace, terrified, put his hands over his ears, and Dan was sitting rigid in his chair, his face white. As for me, I may not have been scared before, but this was insane. It was like a hideous fantasy. The breathing was mounting and mounting, as if it was working up towards a climax, the peak of some grotesque effort. Soon it was the screaming breath of a runner who runs too far and too fast, the breath of a terrified animal. And then suddenly there was a roar of sound and energy that made me cover my eyes and sent Dan Machen hurtling off his chair and halfway across the room. Seymour Wallace shrieked like a woman and dropped to his knees. I heard a blizzard of splintering glass from somewhere in the house and things clattering and falling. Then there was silence. I opened my eyes. Seymour Wallace was crouched on the floor, shaken but unhurt. It was Dan I was worried about. He was lying on his back, unmoving, and his face was a ghastly white. I picked up his fallen chair and then knelt beside him and patted his cheek. "Dan, are you okay? Dan!" Seymour Wallace said, "Maybe I'd better call an ambulance." I raised one of Dan's eyelids with my thumb. His twitching eyeball showed that he was still alive, but he must have been in a deep state of concussion or shock. They'd taught me that much in the Army, apart from how to blow up paddy fields and defoliate 25 acres in just as many minutes. While Seymour Wallace called the emergency service, I covered Dan with my jacket and switched on the beaten-up old electric fire to keep him warm. Dan didn't tremble or shake. He just lay there flat on his back, white and still, and while I listened close to his lips, I could only just hear him breathing. I slapped him a couple of times, but it was just like slapping a lump of baker's dough. "They'll be right around," reported Seymour Wallace, setting down the phone. I lifted my head. For a moment, I thought I heard that breathing again, that soft, rustling breath. But it was only Dan, struggling to keep himself alive. The house itself seemed to have gone back to its ancient secret sleep. Seymour Wallace knelt slowly and arthritically down beside me. "Do you have any idea what that was?" he asked me. "That noise, all that power? I couldn't believe it. It's never happened before." "I don't know. Maybe some kind of pressure release. Maybe you've got some kind of air pressure that sometimes needs to get free. I don't know what the hell it was." "Do you still think it's a ghost?" I glanced at him. "Do you?" Seymour Wallace thought for a moment and then shook his head. "If it's a ghost, then it's a damned powerful ghost. I never heard of a ghost that could lay people flat." He looked down at Dan's pallid face and bit his lip. "Do you think he's going to be all right?" he asked me. I didn't know what to say. All I could do was shrug and kneel in that dingy library and wait for the ambulance. He was sitting propped up in bed when I went to visit him the following morning. He had a bright green-painted private room overlooking the bay, and the nurses had filled the room with flowers. He was still pale, but the doctors were keeping him under observation, but he was cheerful enough. I gave him a copy of Playboy and that morning's Examiner, and I pulled up a tubular steel and canvas chair. He opened the Playboy center spread and took a quick and critical look at the brunette. "Just what I need," he said dryly, "a short burst of over-adrenalization." "Well, I thought it might work better than a paracetamol," I told him. "How do you feel?" He laid the magazine down. "I'm not sure. I feel okay in myself, no worse than if someone had knocked me on the head with a baseball bat." He paused and looked at me. The pupils of his eyes, even behind his Clark Kent spectacles, seemed unusually tiny. Maybe it was just the drugs they'd given him. Maybe he was still in a mild state of concussion. But somehow he didn't quite look like the same Dan Machin that I had met for a drink the previous evening. There was something starry about him, as if his mouth was saying one thing and his mind was thinking another. "You don't look yourself," I told him. "Is that what you mean?" "I don't feel myself. I don't know what it is, but I feel definitely odd." "Did you feel anything strange when that explosion happened?" I asked him. He shrugged. "I don't even remember. I remember the breathing and the way it built up, but after that, well, I just don't recall. I get the feeling I was attacked." "Attacked? By what?" "I don't know," said Dan. "It's real hard to explain. If I knew how to tell you, I would, but I can't." "Do you still think it was a ghost or a spirit?" I said. He ran his hand through his crew cut. "I'm not too sure. It could have been some kind of poltergeist, the kind of spirit that hurls things around. Or it may even have been an earth tremor. Perhaps there's a fault directly under the house." "Suddenly you're looking for rational explanations again?" I told him. "I thought of that, and there's no tremor reported in the paper today. I asked around at the office, too, and nobody else felt one." Dan reached over and helped himself to a glass of water. "In that case, I haven't a clue. Maybe it was a ghost. But I always believed that ghosts were pretty harmless, on the whole. They walk around with their heads under their arms, clanking their chains, but that's about it." I walked over to the window and looked down at the mid-morning traffic crossing the Golden Gate. The fog had lifted since early on, but a last haze still clung around the uprights of the bridge, smudging them like a watercolor painting. "I've arranged to go back to the house this evening," I said. "I really want to take a good look all around and see what's going on there. I'm taking Brian Corder from the engineering department, too. I had a talk with him this morning, and he guessed it might be some kind of katabatic draft." Dan Machin, when I turned again, didn't appear to have heard. He was sitting up in bed, staring absent-mindedly across the room, and his lower jaw had dropped open slack. "Dan?" I said. "Did you hear something?" He blinked at me. "Dan?" I walked quickly across to the bed and took his arm. "Dan, are you okay? You look really ill." He licked his lips as if they were very dry. "Sure," he said uncertainly. "I'm okay. I guess I just need some rest. That's all. Once I came out of the concussion, I didn't sleep too good. I kept having dreams." "Well, why don't you ask the nurse for a sleeping tablet?" "I don't know. I just kept having these dreams, that was all." I sat down again and looked at him intently. "What kind of dreams? Nightmares?" Dan took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. No, they weren't nightmares. I guess they were kind of scary, but they didn't seem to frighten me. I dreamed about that door knocker, that one at the old man Wallace's house. But it wasn't a door knocker at all. I dreamed it was hanging on the door, but it was talking to me. Instead of metal, it was made of real hair and real flesh, and it was talking to me, trying to explain something to me in this kind of quiet, whispery voice. Well, what was it saying? Don't light fires in the forest? Dan Machen didn't seem to see the joke. He shook his head seriously and said, It was trying to tell me to go somewhere, to find something, but I couldn't make out what it was. It kept explaining and explaining, and I could never understand. It was something to do with that bear on Mr. Wallace's stairs, that little statue of the bear with a face like a woman, but I couldn't get the connection at all. I frowned at Dan's white, grave face for a while, but then I grinned and gripped his wrist in a friendly squeeze. You know what you're suffering from, Dan, old buddy? Post-ghost delusion. It's an occult type of postnatal depression. Have a few days' rest and you won't even remember what you were talking about. Dan grimaced. He didn't seem to believe me at all. Listen, I told him, we're going to go over that house tonight with a fine-tooth comb, and whatever it was that laid you out, we'll find it. We won't only find it, we'll bring it back alive, and you can keep it in a jar in your laboratory. Dan attempted a smile, but it wasn't much of one. Okay, he said quietly, do what you like. I sat there for a few more minutes, but Dan didn't seem to be in a conversational mood. So I gave him one more friendly squeeze of the hand and said, I'll drop in tomorrow, round about the same time. Dan nodded, without looking up. I left him and went out into the hospital corridor. A doctor was on his way to Dan's room, and he brushed past me as I came out. As he opened the door, I said, Doctor? The doctor looked at me impatiently. He was a short, sandy-haired man with a pointed nose and purple bags under his eyes like the drapes of an old-fashioned theater curtain. A badge on his lapel said, Dr. James T. Jarvis. I nodded towards Dan's room. I don't like to intrude. I'm only a friend of Mr. Machen's, not a relative or anything, but I just wanted to know if he was okay. I mean, he seemed pretty strange today. Well, what do you mean by strange? Well, not quite himself. Dr. Jarvis shook his head. That's not unusual after severe concussion. Give him a few days to get over it. Was that really all it was? Concussion? The doctor lifted his clipboard and checked it out. That's all, apart from the asthma. What asthma? He doesn't have asthma. The doctor stared at me baldly. You trying to tell me my job? Of course not, but I play squash with Dan Machen. He doesn't suffer from asthma. He never has, as far as I know. The doctor kept his hand on the handle of Dan's door. Well, that's your view, Mr. What's your view? I asked him. The doctor smirked. I'm afraid that's confidential between me and my patient, but if he doesn't have asthma, he certainly does have a severe respiratory complaint. It was exacerbated by the concussion, and he spent 3 or 4 hours last night with a breathing mask on. I don't think I've ever come across a case quite as severe. A pretty brunette nurse in a tight white uniform came along the corridor with a tray of hypodermic syringes and bottles of medicine. She said, I'm sorry I'm behind, Mr. Jarvis. Mrs. Walters needed changing again. That's all right, said Dr. Jarvis. I've just been having a top-level medical conference with Mr. Machen's learned friend here. I've been learning so much. I'm almost reluctant to drag myself away. He opened Dan Machen's door wider, but I said, Please, just one thing, and held his arm. He paused and looked down at my hand as if something nasty had just dropped on his sleeve from a passing awk. Listen, he said sourly, I don't know what kind of native expertise you have in the field of diagnostic medicine, but I have to continue with your friend's treatment program right away, so please excuse me. It's just the breathing, I said. It could be important. Of course it's important, retorted Dr. Jarvis sarcastically. "If our patients don't breathe, we get seriously concerned." "Will you hear me out?" I snapped. "Last night, Dan Machin and I got ourselves involved with something to do with breathing. I need to know what made you think he had an asthma attack." "What the hell are you talking about? Something to do with breathing? You mean you were sniffing glue? Something like that?" "I can't explain. It wasn't drugs, but it could be real important." Dr. Jarvis closed the door again and sighed with exaggerated exasperation. "All right, if you really need to know, Mr. Machin was panting and gasping. Every 90 minutes or so, he began to breathe heavily, finally working up to a real climax of panting. That was all. It was severe and it was unusual, but there was nothing to suggest that it wasn't a regular attack of asthma." "I've just told you, though, he doesn't have asthma." Dr. Jarvis lowered his head. "Will you get out of here?" he said quietly. "Visiting time is over, and the last thing I need is homespun advice, okay?" I was about to say something else, but then I checked myself. I guess I would have been just as irked if somebody had strayed into my office and tried to tell me how to exterminate bugs. I raised my hands in a conciliatory gesture and said, "Okay, I get you. I'm sorry." The nurse opened the door and went in, while I turned to leave. Dr. Jarvis said, "I really didn't mean to be rude, but I do know what I'm doing. You can come back again at 5 if you want to. We should know some more by then." At that second, there was a shrill and a horrified shriek from inside Dan Machin's room. Dr. Jarvis looked at me, and I looked at Dr. Jarvis, and we both banged the door wide open and pushed our way inside. What I saw right then, I couldn't believe. It was there in front of my eyes, but I couldn't believe it. The nurse was standing, rigid with shock, by the side of Dan Machin's bed. Dan Machin himself was sitting upright in bed, in his blue-striped hospital pajamas, as normal and ordinary as you could think of, but his eyes were terrifying. His glasses had fallen to the floor, and his eyes were total blazing red, the eyes of a vicious dog caught in a searchlight at night, or the eyes of a demon. What's more, he was breathing in and out, with the deep, groaning breaths that we had all heard in Seymour Wallace's house only last night, those heavy, endless breaths of a sleeper who could never wake. He was breathing like the house itself, like everything that had chilled and frightened us in the gloomy and ancient rooms, and it seemed as if the hospital room itself went deathly cold with every breath. Dr. Jarvis said, "My God, what is it?" Well, that's an exciting first part of the story, and I hope you'll join us next week for Chapter 2 of The Charnel House. And until then, have a great week, everyone.